That's what I was.
All right. Thank you, Marco. Welcome, everybody, to this second session of the Azure Fundamentals Series. Today, we're a little bit different, a little bit of change in the schedule. We're going to talk about still core IaaS and network services and about storage, but we're also going to hit some of the PaaS and database. I adjusted things a little bit just based on what we needed for the time. So, but still action-packed session today. We're going to do a little bit different. We're going to actually show some, I'll show some demos today as well, and provide you guys with also the GitHub link at the end of the session for the Microsoft Learn Labs for Azure Fundamentals as well, so that you can start to learn a little bit about these core services on your own if you're new to the Azure environment. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dwayne Natwick. I'm a Microsoft Azure MVP and a cloud training architect for Opsgility and Skill Me Up. I am also a Microsoft certified trainer and a regional lead, and you can find me on the social media links on this slide. So as I was saying, we're going to go through some of the core Azure services, compute, networking, storage, and we're also going to hit on databases a little bit today. And then some of the other PaaS services will be next week as well. Some of the microservices and those type of services will move into next week, but I pulled databases into this week. So let's talk about the primary compute services within the Azure environment. So obviously very important, some of the, the key features and, the key building blocks of the Azure environment are compute, networking, and storage for the most part, and so everything kind of revolves around those three main components. And whether it's a infrastructure as a service type component or platform as a service solution, you're talking about there's compute on the back end. And we talked about that last week when we were talking about cloud concepts and the basic cloud services. With the Azure, the fundamental compute services, we have the virtual machines, virtual machine skill sets, app services, then we have the container services and things like that that are also part of it. And what you can think about is what those compute services are those on-demand services that provide the disks and processing power and memory and operating systems that you're going to be running your applications on. So here, from a foundational standpoint, what are the compute services? They are, from an infrastructure as a service standpoint, we think about Azure virtual machines and virtual machine scale sets, which provide that auto scaling of virtual machines on a basis of of what the demand is on the processing power of that machine, and what that provides when you're building a scale set is it's providing that elasticity of the cloud environment. So you can put multiple virtual machines in a scale set and build those up and down as required, scaling those out rather than up or down where you would, and to just kind of give a little bit of definition around that, when you're thinking of scaling within the Azure environment, there's scaling out and there's scaling up, and scaling out and in and scaling up and down. So scaling up and down would be to take a virtual machine and add CPU and memory to it. And generally to do that, you have to turn off that virtual machine and redeploy it within the Azure environment. If you're doing a scale set, if you have an application that can run across multiple operating systems, you can scale out and scale in, which means you start to just add virtual machines of the same SKU, the same processing power as the original virtual machine, but you're duplicating that virtual machine, and then you're balancing the load using load balancers and things like that. App Services is a platform as a service offering that can provide the same thing depending on what app service you're providing, but it's now you're putting your application on a pre-built operating system that's now managed by Microsoft. So you're no longer having to manage the patching and security patches and management of that operating system. App service, a good way to move into app services is a web service. Is, you know, if you have a web site that you are hosting within your data center on virtual machines, you could very easily move that into an app service. And then functions. And somebody asked me last week about function as a service when we were talking about the as a service cloud services. And, you know, functions are, again, another platform-based compute service where it is based on an event, and those are those microservices that we'll talk more about. I think it's on the slides for next week, but those services are really infrastructure as code, where you are no longer managing any infrastructure. The compute and the scaling of that compute is completely based on demand, and Microsoft does that scaling even for you. So as you look at this slide and see how that all evolves into a service where you're no longer managing the compute and the office resources, or the operating system resources, I apologize. You're now managing just your application. So that's becoming much more helpful. Now you're an application developer instead of an infrastructure manager. Container services take that a little bit further as well, where they're, again, a virtualized environment, and they are generally a platform environment where you are now running those services. You're running that application, again, as a code-based service without the need to touch an operating system. And there are two services within the Azure environment to have yourself familiar with, and that's the Azure Container Instances, and then there's Azure Kubernetes Service, which anybody that's beginning to look at the cloud or do any follow any social media around Azure or any of the other cloud service providers, Kubernetes is obviously becoming that de facto standard for container services across all of those cloud environments. But Azure Container Service is a good start to containers for testing and for development type purposes of an application. If you're trying to determine whether your application can run on container services, this is really for a single application type environment where Azure Kubernetes provides a orchestrated service for managing a large number of containers, multiple applications on those containers, and balancing out the workload of multiple applications and orchestrating that in one compute environment, where container instances is just that. It's very similar to what you would do with a virtual machine instance. It's a single instance for single application. So hopefully that's a quick high-level overview of compute services, and it's important to understand the differentiation of all of those, and hopefully quickly at a high level I provided that for you, because in essence of time, I'm not spending probably as much time as I would in a full-fledged one-day course on fundamentals. But it's important to understand the differences between those virtual machines, app services, container services are really three key pieces in there, and then you throw some of the microservices like Azure Functions in there, and you need to, and those are things that you need to take into account when you're preparing yourself for the Azure Fundamentals exam, to know how to differentiate those and know essentially the definition of them, because you could be asked questions to determine what the best service is for compute based on a certain scenario. And then we get into the networking services, and the foundational building block of all network services within Azure is the Azure Virtual Network, or VNet, and these provide the secure communication between Azure resources, and provides a a segmentation of resources as well within virtual networks or VNets. Think of it very, if you're a networking person and understand and have ever set up a switch with VLANs. VNet is very similar to a VLAN. You can set up and build out each of your applications to a specific VNet to segment it from the other VNets. And then you can peer those VNets as well, provide transmission between them as needed, but you're building a IP schema and subnet based on each of those virtual networks. And then you can expand out and build those blocks accordingly. It's like a big Lego set, if you want to think about it that way. Azure load balancers, I brought that up when a couple slides ago when we were talking about scale sets. Load balancers help to scale those resources and balance exactly what it is. It balances the load between virtual machines and helps within a high availability type architecture to allow you to scale out and scale in those virtual machines. And those load balancers provide a heartbeat to see where those virtual machines lie, that they're active, so that a user that is coming into your environment does not get a 404 code for that application not being available. It will find a virtual machine that is active and route to that virtual machine by various different means, whether it's by traffic, by round robin and things like that. Azure load balancers aren't super intelligent. They generally just will sequence through each of the virtual machines, but there are some settings that you can put into place for the load balancers to keep them hold on to a session. So if somebody's accessing, say, your website on the other side of a load balancer and they're building a shopping cart, the load balancer is intelligent enough that if that person goes away and that it doesn't time out, that they can get back on and they can hold on to that same session rather than going to a different virtual machine and losing their entire shopping cart. VPN gateway is utilized very similar to a firewall, could be utilized as well to provide the traffic between potentially VNets across subscriptions, as well as to an on-premises type environment. You turn on a virtual VPN gateway, create that IPsec connection to your on-premises data center, and have that communication between the two. Within the Azure environment, it's important to know that this is a platform-based service, and it is highly available for controlling your application delivery and controlling your connection. So it is a cloud native gateway that will scale as you need it. So you don't have to worry about what I need, what my requirements are for my connectivity, because it'll scale with you. The Azure Application Gateway does a little bit of a mesh between an Azure load balancer and a gateway, where it can provide the management of traffic to web applications. So it works a little bit higher up the stack than the transmission layer that an Azure load balancer works on, but it will also provide that routing of traffic, and has a little bit more intelligence built in than a load balancer does. And obviously with that comes a little bit more of a cost as well. And the last thing on this slide is the content delivery network. And the best example of what a content delivery network is that I can give, that everybody probably can relate to, is Netflix. Netflix provides content delivery network capabilities in how you access your content within Netflix, or say Amazon Prime, or those streaming video services that you purchase. When you purchase or access a video on that service, that video is being grabbed from the primary data center that it is being stored, and it is bringing that to an edge device that is within your region and caching that on that device. So So rather than building a data center with large amounts of storage, that's being stored temporarily now within a geographic area close to you. Therefore, it can be provided to you on a fast access level, so that you don't have latency where you're getting a spinning wheel and getting buffering. Years ago, and you go stream have the best internet connection, or you don't know where you're actually getting it from, you get that spinning wheel that it's buffering, and it was really difficult to stream that service and to have any continuity in what you were watching, because it kept pausing on you as you're trying to watch it, maybe mid-sentence of that movie or something like that. As we've evolved with cloud services and the network of that content delivery network, now we can deliver those services with lower latency and less buffering that's required, because now that video is delivered to you close by. And if somebody then comes behind you within the same geographic area as you and accesses that same video, they get the benefit of that also still being cached there for a certain amount of time, and and they don't have to then grab that from the headquarters storage location. It's already cached there, so they actually get that video promptly as well delivered to them. So the CDN is a very powerful tool, especially, and video streaming is the best example of how that is utilized. As we go into databases, we start talking about data categories. And so it's important, from a fundamental standpoint, just to understand the fundamental differences between each of these data categories. We have structured data, semi-structured data, and unstructured data. And the differences between the three, as you can see here, they're giving, for structured data is a standard schema, and the best example, and we'll get into it when we talk about the databases, is a SQL database. SQL is a structured data type environment. Then we get into some of those semi-structured data services, such as Cosmos DB or MySQL or PostgreSQL, are semi-structured type databases. They don't have a particular schema or particular data fields and properties with those that are the same, but they have some similar data fields that can be referenced to each other, and that's how generally they access their data. So the data access then becomes much more flexible and can then process much larger amounts of data. And that's really why you don't see Microsoft SQL as being viewed as one of those big data solutions, because it's too structured to be able to access and adapt and evolve with the amount of data that's being ingested by many of the tools out there. And then finally, unstructured data, which is a no schema type environment, and that's non-relational. And generally, an Azure storage environment is what really is unstructured data. OneDrive is considered unstructured data. You have metadata, but you have files such as PDFs and JPEGs and videos that are just put into you might create a container or file structure for that, but it's really unstructured data. There's really no rhyme or reason to it. It's dump of different types of data. There's metadata that you can search on and things like that within there, but it is unstructured. Semi-structured data is some examples of that. You look at like JSON documents, HTML documents, books, blogs. Those are a little bit more structured because they might have an author, a publisher, a date that it was published, things like that make it semi-structured, and some keys that you can then grab on. When you think of structured data, we think of like financial data, of spreadsheets and things like that, where you have a row and a column that is creating your your table. You're creating a table so to speak. So when we talk about the Azure storage services themselves and what their categories are that they fall in terms of infrastructure as a service and PaaS services, platform services, there are different different services that kind of fall in and are utilized depending on what the service is. Within the infrastructure as a service, with we're talking virtual machines, so we're talking about disk storage, as well as we're talking about file storage, which is typical to what what you would think about in terms of computer-based storage, right? With traditional server hardware, traditional desktop type hardware, you have your disk drive, you have your files. So those are very typical to that type of IaaS type build within an operating system. Some key things around disks is and it's important to understand the types of disks that you have. Generally, with a virtual machine, you're going to stand up managed disks. You're also going to have different disk storage for your temporary storage, or for your page blobs, might be stored for your snapshots, and then your blocks that are also your temporary storage within your environment. And then you have your file storage, and we'll get into some of these when you look across. Now that we talk about the managed disks and the disks on the virtual machine, now the other four columns that are in here, whether they're IaaS or PaaS, fall into the Azure storage compartments. So when you create an Azure storage account within the Azure environment, you have each of these four. You have files, you have containers, which used to just be called blob storage. Now they've gone into using containers as the terminology for that. So don't get those containers and blobs when you're talking about a storage account are one and the same. Then we have tables and queues. So those all fall, the containers, tables, and queues all fall into that platform type storage environment. As we talk about networking and talk more about networking, it's important to understand what you have to do in terms of securing that environment. And securing that environment, we generally look at a defense in depth approach. And when we talk about defense in depth, we're talking about a multi-layered approach to protecting your data, which is at the center of all of this. And we need to think about each of these layers and building security at each of these layers for a particular reason that one layer is easy for somebody that specializes in that area to break, but to have the ability to break all of these layers, and if you think about any kind of espionage type movie, or Die Hard's one that I think about when I think about defense in depth. If you remember them trying to drill through and break through those layers of that safe as they were trying to get into that safe, there were multiple layers that IT professional, their guy, was trying to break through. They were not only drilling the door, which was the physical security, but he was at the same time working through different other layers of security within there. So you have your physical security, and we're going to talk a minute about the shared services type security environment. Within a cloud you have your physical security, which is your building, which is your locks on your doors and things like that, which when you move into the Azure environment no longer becomes your responsibility. It's now Microsoft's responsibility. But you have still 5 additional layers here that are that are going to be at some level or another your responsibility, even some of them that might be Microsoft's. But you need to take all of those things into account and identify what they are and how you're going to protect your environment at each of these layers. And this gets us into what those shared services are. And key thing here is, physical host, physical network, physical data center. When you move into any of the cloud service models, Microsoft's going to take that responsibility on. You have no say, no real negotiation around what is put in place for those physical pieces. Once you get into operating systems and the network controls and application controls and move further into that defense in depth strategy, you do have more responsibility, or at least some shared responsibility. Infrastructure as a service, as I've talked about multiple times, you manage the operating system down. So you need to make sure that you have proper network controls in place. You need to have proper operating system controls and patching to make sure security patches are in place. Make sure your application is patched and that there's no back doors and things like that. Your identity and account access. How are you managing that? How are you creating role-based access control or protecting users from having elevated privileges? That's all on your plate. The endpoints and who's accessing. Are they properly patched? Are the users properly trained in identifying phishing attacks and things like that? Are all things you have to take into account. And then how you're protecting your data at the center of it all, whether it's personal data from your user environment or your customers to the actual financial data of your organization. And as we move across to each of these services, each of them, you start to Microsoft starts to take more control but there's also a lot of shared control there as well. So, Microsoft may provide some network controls or application controls or identity and directory infrastructure controls at the PaaS level, but there's still a lot of services that you have to turn on that you may want to turn on to meet certain standards and protocols and policies that your own organization may have. Once you get to a software as a service such as Microsoft 365, identity becomes one of the most important aspects to your defense in depth and your security, because Microsoft's taking care of all of the controls from the application down now. You no longer have control over how Microsoft Exchange is managed, but you are still managing and need to manage who has access to what, and that's where that identity and account management really comes into play. Now we'll talk about a few security services and go through those real quick. I'm trying to get through these rather quickly so we can go through and I can show you some of the how to stand up some of these services. Azure Firewall we didn't touch on when we were talking about network services, but it is another piece of that network service, but also falls into that network security, where it is now a stateful managed firewall as a service. And like the VPN gateway, where I was saying it's highly available, highly scalable, the Azure Firewall does the same thing. It's a firewall as a service where you have it scales itself. You have the ability now to create rules and provide rules and access layer controls within that stateful firewall environment, as well as the deep packet inspection that you get with any next generation firewall. In addition, with the application gateway, which we talked about in network services, there's a web application firewall within there as well to provide a firewall type protection and rules for web applications. Distributed denial of service protection. Microsoft provides this by default at a basic level for free, because they do require, they want to make sure that their environment is not susceptible to a DDoS attack. So they provide basic services on there. With the basic service, you don't get capabilities such as being able to monitor those services or get reports on those services. You upgrade to those standard services, and then you can tune that protection based on your VNet resources and have a little bit more control over that, as well as get reporting on DDoS attacks as well. So if you're an enterprise that really wants to have and understand what might, where vulnerabilities and attacks might be coming from, highly recommended to use the standard service. But the basic service is provided by for free. It does helps for to maintain availability of your service and removes unwanted traffic on out of the Microsoft security database that they see as dangerous traffic on a global scale. So you don't have to manage and be concerned about that at that point. So like I said, you get that for free as a basic service. If you want more in-depth analysis around what's happening from that standpoint, from a traffic standpoint, and what's being blocked within DDoS, then you need that standard service. Network security groups is again another standard and free network service for security within the Azure environment as well. And what's nice about network security groups is they work to a firewall at a basic level where you can set inbound and outbound rules to filter IP addresses, ports, and protocols within that environment. And when we get into setting up a network, we'll go in and we'll show that real quick as well. It's very powerful from a standpoint of not having to, especially from a dev test standpoint, not needing to stand up a firewall, which could be expensive in a non-production type environment. You can though set up some rules, set up some parameters of who has access or what IP addresses and ports have access to protect your environment even further. And like I said, have that defense in depth. And this is just another layer of defense that you can have within the environment. And then application security groups is on top of that. It's a subset of a network security group, but it's at the application layer where it has additional port filtering capabilities, but can also be utilized for as a way to group together servers like web servers and things like that, and have more of an application level of security also. So it works very similar where you're setting up rules again for inbound and outbound control like a network security group, but it's more it's higher up the layer of the application towards the application layer rather than at the transport layer like a network would be. And here's just kind of bringing it together in terms of thinking about how to combine certain services. You can combine your rules of network security groups with Azure firewalls. Again, web application firewalls can be combined with an Azure firewall. At a perimeter layer, you've got the protection of DDoS protection and firewalls. And then at the network layer, you have your network security group and all your network resources, your VNet to segment, and all of those things. So you can group together multiple services, again, to create that defense in depth approach. So you're putting in place different gates that an attacker is going to have to get through to get into your environment. And finally, I think what we're going to hit on today is the database services. And I talked a little bit about those when we were talking about semi-structured and structured data. And usually when we're talking about databases, we're hitting on those two areas. We're not really talking about unstructured data. That more falls into like a storage account or like a OneDrive and those type of things. But Azure Database Services, we have the two main ones to think about, especially from a fundamental standpoint, is Azure SQL Database and Azure Cosmos DB. The key differentiators are that the SQL database is that relational database as a service. There are three flavors of SQL within an Azure environment that you can do. You can have a SQL database instance, which is you stand up a virtual machine and you load SQL software onto it. That is probably the least beneficial from a cost standpoint within an Azure environment, but it provides more control, just like it's now an infrastructure as a service type SQL delivery. So you are able to get into that SQL environment and tune the SQL software as needed. If you don't need that layer of granularity in how you set up your SQL database, then you have two SQL platform services. You have managed SQL and you have Azure SQL Database. The managed SQL takes it a step further from the SQL instance, and now you're in a managed environment. You have some control, but now Microsoft is managing the SQL. They're managing all the updates, managing backups. All of that is part of the SQL service, and then Azure SQL Database is that full platform database as a service, and you can run. You're now it's a shared net service, very similar to what Microsoft 365 would be, where you've got your SQL database portion that's being utilized and segmented from the rest of anybody else's Azure SQL environment, but it's all running on a shared compute environment. So each one of those, you start giving up a little bit more control, but you're gaining some benefits in terms of cost benefits as well as the management benefits, the decreased management overhead of the operating system or the SQL software at that point, and you're just then utilizing it for a database service, which most database people probably would prefer that. They don't want to be working within the software. They want to just DBAs want to just work in the database itself. Cosmos DB, the important thing to note here is it has multiple APIs to multiple database services, SQL being one of them, as well as like Mongo and Gremlin. The key differentiator around Cosmos DB is it is a globally distributed database service. So you can stand up Cosmos DB and have replication globally. So if you have a database service and a database that needs to have a global footprint, needs to have the capability for users to access it around the world, depending on what region they are, and want low latency, that's what Cosmos DB is for. And the last piece on this slide is the Azure Database Migration, which is a fully managed service to migrate your on-premises databases and multiple database sources to Azure services as well. So you have that capability also. All right, so let's do a couple walkthroughs here on some services here in the last 20 minutes. So we're doing good on time, which is what I was hoping for with this one, because I really wanted to get into this. One thing I'm going to post up into the chat here is the GitHub for Azure Fundamentals for this course. The nice thing here is it has some of the labs and some of the walkthroughs as well that I can do, that you can do on your own. Set up yourself a free account and get into the portal yourself. It helps you understand the services more. So the key thing here is when we get into the Azure portal, the first thing we're going to do is create a resource. And we're going to create a few resources here, but let's start with a virtual machine. So when you go into your services, generally you're going to see the most popular services, and you can see many of these are ones that we talked about today. We'll go ahead and we'll create a Windows server within here first. And even if I pick a Windows server image, I have the capability once I get into creating a virtual machine to change this. I didn't pick Ubuntu, but you know what? I'll just pick a Linux server. I could do that here. You can see that it defaulted. The first was a 2016. If I want a 2012 Windows server or a 2019, I can do that here as well. First and foremost thing that you need to do is create have a resource group. And I didn't really hit on resource groups a whole lot. I think I touched on them last week. Resource groups are what you do to essentially group exactly what it says. I hate to be obvious, but it groups your resources. So, and as I was saying last week, it's good to group your resources together, especially if you're just learning and playing in the environment. Create a resource group for your services, and it makes it very easy then to remove them at the end. So what we're going to do is I'm going to create a resource group here, and whoops, accidentally button there. I'm going to create a resource group, create a virtual machine. You select your location. I'll just leave it as US. Here, if we wanted to have availability in terms of availability set or availability zone, we can do that here. I'm not going to do that. What that's going to do is it's going to add additional virtual machines. It does, when you create those availability sets and availability zones, it essentially duplicates your virtual machine so that you can create a high availability environment. And we'll talk more about that, I think, when we talk about service level agreements and things like that next week or the final week. So I'm not going to hit that a whole lot right now. Here we can select our size, and you can see, these are like recently used sizes that I've had, or ones that are recommended or utilized. Nice thing here is you can see what the cost is per month. I generally, when I'm doing a demo, use the B series. The B is the burstable series, so you're using CPU credits rather than, and it costs, you can see 50% less than a D series. So when you're playing around, B series is good. Generally, a lot of organizations use the D series as like a general purpose production type server, and it's important to take into account and look, review what the different server sizes are. And if you go on Microsoft Docs and look, or even just Google or Bing the Azure server, Azure virtual machine sizes, you can find a chart that kind of goes through the purpose of each of those. And here we'll create then a username, and we'll create a password. I'm going to put no ports available. You can allow certain ports if you wanted to, such as, port 80, port 443, SSH, or RDP for management. I'm going to allow no ports on this for right now. Here's our disks. So here you've got two options for disks. You've got your standard spinning disks, and then you have your solid state disks, both standard and premium. These are the disks for the virtual machine itself. So these are your operating system disks. If you want to add a managed disk, you need to create it here. And here we can create a snapshot, storage blob, or we'll just do an empty disk, because this is going to create that D drive that would be your file storage, right? So that's what we're doing here, and we can share it if we want to. We'll just leave it as a empty disk. Then we have our networking, and when we set up a virtual machine, the nice thing about starting with setting up a virtual machine is when you go through it, it sets all of the basic components up and start you off. So if you are creating an environment and you're going to have a virtual machine in that environment, you might as well just create a virtual machine, because it's going to create your resource group. It's going to create your VNet. It doesn't create a store, and then when you go back and you create a storage account and things like that, that's all in place as well. So that's what we're doing here. We've got our default. Here's our first VNet and subnet being created. We can put it into a network security group, basic or advanced. So that's going to set up my NSG as well on the NIC. We can allow, again, here we can make public those same ports as in the first page. If we decide on our way through that we wanted to do that, we can do that. Here we can also create load balancing. If we were to create an availability set or within this virtual machine group, we then might want to stand up a load balancer as well, so that we can balance traffic between those servers within that availability set. Since this is a single server, it's not necessary right now to create a load balancer. So we'll move on to in the management. Key thing here is you can see it does default to off, which is good. We do have boot diagnostics enabled. That's really activity logging in terms of what's being managed and monitored. We can turn on guest diagnostics as well. Important thing around this, that if you're playing in the environment, you can disable all of this, because the key thing around this is as soon as you turn on any logging, you're going to create a log storage account and stuff's going to start getting stored. So if you're just learning in the environment, you probably best to just disable this, or you can turn this all on just to see what it does. So it's just important thing around that. You can see that my subscription, I have Azure Security Center Standard already turned on. If I didn't have that turned on, it might ask me to do that as well at this point. We go to advanced. Here we can set up, which generation, a host group. Generally, from if you're starting in Azure, this is not really important to you. Tagging. We'll talk about tagging when we talk about governance in a couple weeks, but tags are another way to group resources. So if you're doing departmental billing and things like that, or you're trying to keep tabs on development costs, we could put a dev tag on this virtual machine and this resource group, so that we know that that's going to get billed to the development team. Or if it's an HR server, we can build it back to HR if that's the case, if that's how our organization works. And then we get into just reviewing and creating. And hopefully I don't have any policies that are in place. You can see my validation passed, so that means my virtual machine should turn around and deploy. And you can see here, it's actually going to show me that this virtual machine itself is going to cost me a little less than 6 cents an hour to run it. So having this up and going and demoing this, or even you from a standpoint of creating a free account and using your credits, it's not going to use that many credits if you turn it off soon after you've used it, or soon after you've learned how to deploy. So we're going to let that deploy, and while that's deploying, let's go do something else here. So we showed how within a virtual machine deployment, it deploys a virtual network. Let's deploy a virtual network on our own. So let's go back to adding a resource, and we're going to go down to networking, and we're going to just click on virtual network. So here we're going to, my resource group's already created, so I'm going to use that same resource group, and I'm going to just create another VNet. I'm going to put this one in East US. And one thing you can see, if you notice this in my previous virtual network, is my previous virtual network was a 10.0 network. And the nice thing is that once you have a VNet deployed, is when you go to create another VNet, it's going to sequence that appropriately as to not overlap. Which is important. And one thing we didn't talk about was VNet peering, which I'm going to show in a second. VNet peering does not allow overlapping VNets. So if I try to make this like a 10.0.1, it's going to tell me I can't, that if I do that, I'm going to have an overlapped network and I won't be able to peer it with that other network. So I want to keep it. So it's good if you are building a greenfield network and IP schema isn't super important to you, and you just leave it with the default as you go along. It's going to continue to sequence that with every new VNet you can create, so it does not overlap, and then it allows you then to, like I said, build those Legos by peering those networks if they need to connect. So let's just review and create. I'm not going to go through any of the additional security features or any on that, because there's not a whole lot to worry about. in terms of creating a virtual network, and then that'll create real quick. And then the last thing that I wanted to do also was let's create a storage account, and then we'll go back and we'll peer our virtual networks as well. So let's go back to creating a resource and go to a storage account, and we'll put that in the same virtual network. We're going to, one thing important about a storage account is it has to be this name has to be unique across the entire Azure environment, because what it does is when I create the storage account, I'm going to be given a URL for each of my container, for my files, and for tables and queues that is a URL that's across the Azure environment. So I generally use DN Cloud as foundation across, because nobody else has DN Cloud, so I can generally put that in front of any of my services that need a unique name, and it's not going to flag me at all. General purpose v2 is going to be our default and Microsoft recommended storage account kind. There's really not a reason anymore to pick P1 or blob storage. You get all of the same features within general purpose v2, so just keep that in mind. I'm going to change this to just local redundant storage, and we'll talk, I think, a little bit more about the redundancy types when we talk about governance and resiliency here in another day. I don't think either next week or the week after that. But we're just going to do local redundant storage, which is just in one data center environment. Here we can create public endpoints if we want. We can add data protection. Good best practices, put soft delete on. Essentially what that does is creates a recycle bin. Here we have some advanced features. We can enable large files if we have large file storage. Here you can see secure file transfer is enabled by default, so that means everything's going to transfer through SSL encryption when it's transmitted. Again, tags, and then review and create. And this will create in a moment. And while that's creating, let's go back to my resources, and I'll go to my resource group here that we created, and we're going to go to our virtual networks, and we're going to do a peering real quick here before we end the day. So we have my RG1 VNet, which is the one that created by default. And if I go down here to VNet peerings, I can add a peer on my subscription. I'm going to hit 1 to 2. I'm going to peer it to, and you can see I can't peer to myself, obviously, and if there were any other overlapping IP addresses, it's going to also say I can't peer it. I do have one in East US to peer, and I'm going to name this one. I'm naming this one 1 to 2. I'm naming the other one 2 to 1. Here we can allow traffic between the two. If I want to allow forwarded traffic, I can do that as well between the two. And gateway transit if I had a gateway in place. And just real quick, that'll very quickly peer my networks. And if I refresh, I'm now updating my peering, and it's done, and I'm connected. So peering your network, now I can communicate between both of my VNets if I wanted to. We go back to my resource group, and let me find my network security group in here. And here's my NSG that was created with my virtual machine as well. And you can see here the default policies that are put in place. And the lower the priority number, the higher the priority is. So if I came in here and created something that's 64,000, that's going to take precedent over these other ones. And you can see that Microsoft's default rules start at a deny all rule. And you can see these are deny all. Then we have allow outbound internet. We have inbound load balancing, and we have VNet connections, both inbound and outbound, allowed. So we are already set up, and that's why we could peer so quickly within the environment between the two VNets, because it's allowing VNet to VNet traffic. So when you create that peering, you don't have to go in and create a custom rule to do that. Same thing with load balancer inbound. If we're going to create a public-facing load balancer, we don't have to create a rule to allow that. And that's what's great about these network security groups. If we wanted to create a new rule, it's very easy to go into our inbound rules, and we can add a rule in here for, from a specific IP address or any IP address. We can create the port and allow the port, and set the priority level for that. So if we want to go back in and allow RDP, which is not recommended to create a rule for that, we can do that here. Last thing here, well, we got a couple more minutes, is I wanted to show storage accounts. So where's my storage account in here? There's my storage account. Within the storage account, now we've set up our storage account, and you can see, as we were talking about when we were talking about our storage accounts, we have files, we have containers, tables, and queues. So containers are blobs. So that's very similar to like what OneDrive would be. You can create a file structure of each of those being a container, but again, that's unstructured data. And then your file shares act like a SMB 3.0 file share, where you can actually create file sharing services and essentially create a file server within the Azure environment for users to utilize. So those are some important things around there. Tables and queues are more microservices and things. You can use tables to feed data into an unstructured table source, or queues for different messaging services and things like that. But generally in a storage account, you're going to be utilizing containers and file shares for the most part. So I think we're running low on time here today, so that gets us to the end of this week. So we went through a lot of information this last hour. I went through it pretty quickly. I recommend that for understanding these services to go into the Azure environment at this point, start going through some of those labs that I included as well, and start learning the environment, learning what each of these services can do and what the benefits are, and usually and review each of those on Microsoft Docs. Generally, you can find a more info tab or button within each of the services as well, to be able to view those services. So if I go into my resources and create a resource, and I go into the virtual machine, you can click Learn More here, and it's going to take you right to Microsoft Docs. So a very helpful resource from that standpoint. And next week, we're going to talk more about the Azure solutions, some of those micro solutions. We're going to talk more about Azure Active Directory and some more security tools next week as well. So that gets us to that service, and then we'll talk about governance and subscriptions a little bit the final week, which is, I think, when we get into a little bit more resiliency tools and things like that also. So I'll wrap up with any questions, and if you could, please, I'm going to post my Metrics That Matter link here in the chat. If you could also evaluate this session for me on Metrics That Matter, it helps me with my Microsoft Certified Trainer renewal as well. So if you could do that, I would really appreciate it. So again, thank you. I didn't see any questions in the chat necessarily. So, and I know I see.
Yeah, I don't see as well, Dwayne.
Yep, I see sure. Marco, I see you posted also a survey as well for feedback to the session. So
yes, I did. I can see Juarez as well posted there. It's just for registration for this session. So anyone feel free to register if there is anyone. You can find it there. No, I don't think there is any questions happening, but I just need to inform people about some other things which is gonna happen during this week and also within I would say 2 weeks. So I just posted on the chat a couple of things in relation to our events. So the first thing first, it's about our Ideathon, Cloud Launch Learning Ideathon, which is going to happen on 24th of October. It's basically online event that is actually online challenge that brings people together to work together and to build ideas to solve the real world problems. In this case, we have the problems around the dementia. So it's very interesting for people to participate. You personally don't need to be a coding expert. Everyone is welcome. You don't need to worry about the coding skills. Implementation is not the part of this challenge. So this event is meant to be inclusive to everyone, non-tech, tech, everyone. We do have already signed up more than 20 people. So we are looking forward for more people. So you can sign up freely. You can sign up individually if you are alone, or if you have an existing team or your own team, you can bring the team on board as well. If you are alone, feel free. There is options to sign up individually, so you can sign up and you will go to some existing team. It's going to happen on 24th of October. It's a great opportunity to apply your own knowledge and skills to solve the real challenges. Of course, we are giving as well prizes. Is waiting for you. So you just need to basically design the solution with your team and solve this reveal challenge, and you will get later on the awards categories going to happen, and we will announce them to you. So this is the main event. In terms of the next sessions, as Dwayne mentioned, he's having a next session next Monday, the same time. He's going to talk much more in details about the core PaaS and database services. The links are in the chat as well. So next Monday, in terms of the other sessions as well, we have today. We have a second session around Kubernetes series, creating, deploying Kubernetes manifests. I included the link there in the chat, so you can feel free to register. It's around like 6 o'clock local time. And lastly, this Friday, we have a third session around the governance and automation series, exploring Azure resources with Azure Resource Graph. So feel free to join us as well. We have plenty of great sessions happening during this week and next one, and we hope to see you there as well. Before I finish as well, I want to thank Dwayne for amazing presentation and great session. I want to thank everyone that joined us today, and please use the links in the chat to provide as well feedback in terms of these sessions. You can, as Dwayne mentioned, it will be great if you can just use a couple of minutes and just provide feedback in terms of his presentation as well. We have another. Around our whole, I would say, Cloud Launch and Learn, there is also a link in the chat. So thank you all, and Dwayne, if you want to say something for the last, feel free. Yeah. See you next week then.
Yeah. If you have any questions or anything, as you're going through your studying for AZ 900, feel free, reach out to me on, comment on, on my blog site, or LinkedIn or Twitter. I monitor those regularly, so happy to help you. I want everybody to be successful. If you are studying for the AZ 900, like for you to pass the test. So thanks everybody for the time, and see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you all.